Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today is special because this is a sponsored video. The artists over at SuperShark asked me if I was interested in painting one of their sculpts, and as soon as I saw their latest release of Apocalypse, I was sold. So they sent me over the STL and they covered all the resin for this one. I was even able to convince them to let me supersize this all the way up to 1/5 scale. So a special thank you to SuperShark for making this video happen. Now with a statue this big, I'm gonna have to get down to business fast before the 4 horsemen come for me. So I'm gonna grab my brushes. Let's get started. After printing everything out, I was left with some pretty serious gaps along the seams. This is fairly common when you print this large. Even a tiny amount of warp on a part can lead to gaps that need to be filled. Here, I've already filled the gaps using a bit of milliput, but these putty lines will ruin the look of the base and must be dealt with. While sanding down is an option, a second choice is building up. With an Egyptian theme, extra sand really won't look out of place. So I started by putting down some Elmer's glue and then poured a thin layer of sand on top. For this first pass, I focused on covering up the putty lines for a bit of camouflage. Once dry, I made a second pass over everything as more of an all-over sanding. I made sure not to get any of this sand in the footprints, otherwise I risked not getting a good seating for the model. After an hour to dry, I thinned down the glue with a bit of water and painted a thin coat over all of the sand. This will act like a sealer to make sure that the sand won't come loose later during painting, especially with dry brushing. Once everything was covered, I put it aside to dry and went on to handle the metallics. And here is where I have to apologize. My camera ended up yorking all of the footage, but it was my typical black gloss followed by a metallic finish. Then I gave him a top coat of blue speed paint as a filter. The only footage that survived from this section was me putting the gloss coat to protect everything. To start painting the body, I loaded up uniform gray. I sprayed this as a base for his legs and torso. On the legs, I tried to be mindful and thin it out where I wanted some of the black to peek through as a shadow. While comparatively, the arms got a bit more overall coverage. This is because this area is going to have more light on it, so the shadow shouldn't be too strong except for maybe underneath the arms. To highlight, I moved up to foggy gray. Here I maintained a high spray angle relative to the model. Doing this gives me a soft drop off of the peaks into the shadows. Sort of like getting a semi-synthetic highlight for free. When it comes to shading, using techniques like this is like getting twice the work for half the effort. For his torso, I adhered to the high spray angle less. Again, because it should have more light and softer shadows. So I traced out the larger muscles and feathered it a bit to the darker areas. Now, the thing to think about when painting a character like Apocalypse is his color palette. Here, I'm pretty limited to muted blues and grays, so I'm gonna have to try to find contrast in different ways. One way I'll be using is having a very warm brown base to offset the very cool tones of Apocalypse. I'll also have some very reflective true metallics along with some flat matte fabrics. By leaning into techniques like these, I can still incorporate a lot of contrast in my project even with a limited color palette. Next, I queued up some graveyard gray speed paint. I wanted to stiffen up a few shadows here and there, this time shooting from below the model to maintain my light direction. And instead of tracing the muscles, I'm tracing the valleys in between. When it comes to his legs underneath his loincloth, I make sure to get a flash of color up there and leave it at that. If anybody's sneaking a peek under the hood, it's more on them that they got disappointed what they found. I wonder what they actually expected to see. Once dry, the legs were looking pretty good for now. Time to focus back on the torso with Solemn Gray. After a bit of masking to cover my earlier work, I used this muted blue-gray to base the center mass. Personally, I think it's a dead ringer for his typical desaturated palette. This is almost a depressing blue, but it'll look good next to the gray and pair well with our metallics. Once I had a good tone, I left it to dry and started working on the base. First, using Espresso Craft Paint. This paint dries to a super matte and dusty finish, just perfect for a desert base. So I used an overbrush to base everything. Now, since the sand is so textured, it can be difficult to get full coverage. But since I'm going to be coming back over this with an airbrush, I didn't bother spending too much time with it. It was more important to get good coverage over all the areas where the stone was still exposed. With all the extra texture from the added sand, this ended up being a moderate level of brush abuse. Thankfully, my big dumb brush was ready to serve. Next up, tan as a highlight. Yep, I'm using a second craft paint. This is a large project with a lot of surface to cover with paint. When it comes to bases, this is an area you can save a bundle on by using craft paints. So be sure to save your fancy paints for the areas that need to be fancy. Since here I'm painting rocks and dirt, craft paint is gonna get me there. It's better to use 50 cents of this than $6 worth of a name brand. Next, I took it to the spray booth for a bit of earth. Now it was time to paint the sand. I felt earth was an appropriate start. The light areas you see are spots where I wanted to add a little bit more sand. They may stand out now, but after a few layers of paint, they'll blend in fine. I did get a bit silly and hand painted in some patches of sandstone to cover them up, just to make it a little bit easier to blend them into the background. Here I'm using this gold base as a filter to blend the patches together. This is going to take multiple light mistings, and I had to make sure to rotate the base often, as a high grit of the sand can sometimes hide areas that need a bit more paint. Next, I grabbed mountain stone to paint the 4 stone faces of the base. Originally, I was going to paint these as natural skulls wearing their classic outfits, but on second thought, I ended up landing on stone as it was a better fit for the piece overall. But I did want some contrast from the rest of the base, as these faces have lore significance of being iterations of the 4 horsemen. Now for a wash in Nuln Oil. This was a quick all-over wash, just making sure not to overwash, and instead use multiple washes to get a high amount of definition on all the surface details. I followed this up with ash gray. I put this on as a heavy dry brush, looking to get about 70% coverage. So long as you don't use an overloaded brush, dry brushing gives you the time to build up the color until you hit the intensity that you like. Finally, foggy gray. This was used as a feather-light dry brush across the key features of each face, like across the brow line and down the center line, namely the T-zone. Once they were looking good, I gave the same treatment to all the miniature figures that slot around the base. I imagine these as being little snippets of Apocalypse Rain, which is a really cool detail to add. Unfortunately, I think I might have broke a couple of these during cleaning, but thankfully they're supposed to be centuries old stone statues, so it totally makes sense that a few of them are damaged and missing a limb or two. Thankfully, all of these minis came separate, because printing and painting these with the base as one piece would have been a pain. So thanks, SuperShark. Once all the figures were highlighted up, I set them aside to dry. While all that dries, this is a great opportunity for me to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Your monthly generosity helps keep the lights on, and for that, I can't thank you enough. And I want to sneak in an extra thank you to the good people over at SuperShark for sponsoring this video. If you'd like to check out this model for yourself, be sure to check out the link I'll have down in the description. But for now, those parts are looking pretty dry, so let's get back to work. First thing up, basing the loincloth in solemn gray. Using the same gray as with the chest is not a lazy choice, but it creates a common starting place. Even if the final highlights are going to be different, the two sections will just feel like they go together. Next, a bit of blue ink. The ink here is going to settle deep into the texture of the fabric and give me a bit extra surface variation. This will also step down the brightness so I don't have to go too bright on the highlight. This way I can still get a good amount of contrast while maintaining that narrow palette range. Finally, to add a soft highlight, electric blue. To ensure a soft transition of this highlight, I switched to a very light dry brush, but there are two patterns to pay attention here. There are the obvious folds, but also the fabric has a grain to the texture as well. Keeping the strokes perpendicular to them both, this helps ensure the highlights stay out of the deep folds and maintain the shadow hues on the peaks, keeping the visual interest high. While it does take a few strokes to get the color to start to show, using fast hands, it only takes a few minutes to get great results. Now to add some details to the metallics with chainmail. Here I'm going around the chromed areas with this chainmail to paint all the screw heads and various details. Steps like this help break up large blocks of color. The takeaway here though is to make sure that you stay consistent with your colors. If one screw is going to be silver, they all have to be silver on both boots. Not doing so can lead to a slapdash, disorganized look. Next up, glorious gold for his belt. A quick and controlled dry brush handled the belt. I picked a gold for this for the same reason I picked gray for the stone faces on the base. I wanted to break up this large block of cool colors on the model with some warm gold. And this big chunky belt in the middle is a perfect candidate for a solution. This gold color here will help draw eyes up the model as a small landmark. Additionally, the contrasting gold has a bit of a slimming effect along with the dark wide detail of his torso. Not only does it make it look taller, but it emphasizes the girth of his shoulders, making him a bit more imposing. Next, I use shiny silver to do the buckle. You know, I really miss these classic comic designs, and sometimes I like to imagine the lore that led up to the costume. I imagine Insabanur was walking around a mall in the 80s after thousands of years of existing. He wandered into one of the first Hot Topics and found this belt and was like, "Oh my god, I love this belt. This is gonna be my whole thing." Are you sold on the A? I'm pretty sure we could find you an E somewhere.
No, why would I want an E?
Well, you're in Sabanur, you're from Egypt, you're all about evolution. That's like 3 E's.
It's fine, I'll change my name. From now on, all shall tremble before Andrew.
Andrew?
What's wrong with Andrew?
Nothing. Andrew's fine. It's fine. It just doesn't say end of the world as you know it.
Very well. I shall be Apocalypse. But my friends call me Andy.
Fine. Let me guess. You want to get the matching collar too?
Shut up. Of course I
do. With Andy's A all blinged up, it was time for a bit of weathering with Nuln oil. Using my tiny brush, I dotted in oil into every ding and scar on the surface of the armor. This will help the readability of all the details and battle damage. But care must be taken not to overdo this. Too much Nuln here will cause it to drip and mess with the overall look. I'm looking for damaged, not dirty. I went back for a second pass on the largest spots, while the large shoulder patch got an all-over light wash to help bring out the detailed hieroglyphics. But care must be taken not to overdo this, as excess moisture from the wash can reactivate the contrast paint underneath. And I can't forget about those hands, they got the same treatment too. Now to highlight with a bit of metal medium. Now this isn't exactly a paint, it's a medium that you could use to mix your own custom metallics. But this metallic medium is perfect for highlighting alloys. Putting this on as a light dry brush will easily edge highlight all of the metal while also adding what will look like tiny little surface scratches, aging the metal even further. But you want this to be super light, so heavy use of a texture palette is needed. Not doing so will lead to getting an unwanted thick streak of silver, ruining my earlier work. So keep this in mind and check your brush every time you reload. Time to work on that face of his with a base of charred brown. Now, Apocalypse has a skin tone that can range from a dusky tan to a lifeless yellow beige. Personally, I wanted to go for somewhere between a gray and a brown to tie in with the other colors I had already used. Using this brown as the undercoat will ultimately influence the layers I put over it. Now, because this area was glossy from the metallics I used earlier, this needed a few coats to get full coverage. To highlight the skin, dead flesh. I mixed this in about 50-50 with the charred brown. As per usual with my faces, I started with tracing out where I know I wanted the most light, like the cheekbones and forehead. This way, as I build up the layers of paint, these areas will hit full opacity first, while other areas like in the creases by the nose will only get a single thin pass. This way, the charred brown underneath will darken the dead flesh for a natural looking, low effort shadow. And since Apocalypse always gave me dead guy vibes, I chose not to do another level of highlight and leave his face a little bit flat. To me, it just makes him look a little bit more ancient. Once his skin was on, I dabbed in his red eyes with flat red and a tiny highlight of fire orange. They're hard to see, but if you catch his stare, he has a bit of a fiery glow to his gaze. My dark navy blue was called in for his lips. Well, I'm gonna guess that they're mostly lips, but he definitely has a whole thing going on here. The key takeaway here is to make sure you have some more of his skin tone on hand, ready for any touch-ups. This is one of those details that needs a super clean line or it'll diminish the whole piece. So a bit of back and forth is needed to get a good final look. Then I used matte black to fill in the rest of his scalp. There's not much to talk about here besides laying it down smooth and thin while painting within the lines. The finish of this project is closing in, so it's best to take your time and put in the due diligence it takes to finish strong. This was also a good time to black out the darker crevices around his collar, doing my best to avoid the tubes and cables. For the final bips and bobs, I used a bit of chainmail to finish off the details around his head and piping down his chest. And I called this one done. And wow, look at this beast, he's huge! I'm pretty sure he's the second tallest statue I've ever made. What do you all think? Do you like it, or do you think I should have used MCU Apocalypse as a painting guide? I had a wonderful time painting this, so once again, an extra special thank you to SuperShark for this great opportunity. If you'd like to get your hands on this model and see what else they're cooking up, be sure to check out the link to their Patreon. They're making waves in this industry, and with models like this, I can only see it getting better from here. Now with Apocalypse completed, I gotta get back to finish off that Fantastic Four diorama, so I gotta go. But as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.